Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a topic that is absolutely guaranteed to come up, both in your career and, more importantly, on your bar exams, amending a claim after the limitation period has run out. This is high-stakes stuff, so let's make sure you've got it down cold. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll set the scene with the core problem, the expired limitation period. Then we'll introduce our hero, UCPR Rule 376, and walk through its 3 different pathways. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the crucial appropriate test, dodge a common exam trap involving Rule 69, and finally, we'll look at a little twist in the Civil Proceedings Act that makes Rule 376 the absolute authority. All right, let's start with a scenario that gives every lawyer nightmares. It's that moment you realize the clock has run out and your client's case is hanging by a thread. So, picture this. You're deep into a file and your stomach just drops. You've spotted a huge mistake in the claim. Maybe you sued the wrong company, or you completely missed a cause of action. The real problem? The limitation period ticked over last week. So what do? Is the case just over? Well, thankfully, it's often not doomed at all. And this is where you need to know your UCPR inside and out. The specific purpose-built tool for this exact problem is Rule 376. For your exams, you have to remember, limitation period expired? Your first thought should be Rule 376. Now, the trigger for this rule is super specific, and you need to know it. UCPR Rule 376, Subrule 1, says it only kicks in when a limitation period that was perfectly fine when you started the case has now expired. It's exclusively for this out-of-time situation. Okay, so Rule 376 gives you 3 different doors you can try to open, and you have to pick the right one. First, there's Rule 376 Subrule 2 for when you need to correct a party's name. Second, you've got Rule 376 Subrule 3 for changing the capacity a party is suing in. And third, this is the big one, Rule 376 Subrule 4 for adding a whole new cause of action. Picking the right pathway here is absolutely critical because each one has a completely different test you have to satisfy. So let's break down exactly what you need to prove for each of them. Let's look closely at these tests. Now, see the one thing they all have in common? No matter which subrule you're using, you first have to convince the court that the amendment is appropriate. But that's just the first hurdle. For Subrule 2, a name change, you also have to prove it was a genuine mistake and it wasn't misleading. For Subrule 3, a capacity change, you got to show the party could have sued that way from day one. And for Subrule 4, adding a new claim, it must come from the same or substantially the same facts. So let's zoom in on that universal first hurdle, the appropriate test. What on earth does appropriate actually mean in the court's eyes? Well, it's not just a gut feeling, there are some very clear principles you need to argue. If you get a question on this, the case you have to cite is Hartnett v. Heinz. The court tells us that figuring out if something is appropriate is a balancing act. You've got to look at the big picture goals of the UCPR in Rule 5, justice, efficiency, resolving the real issues, and you have to apply the big principles from the High Court's decision in Aon Risk Services. So in your exam answer, or, in a real courtroom, you need to hit these specific points, which come from cases like Terranora and West Point. You need a solid explanation for why there was a delay. You have to think about any prejudice to the other side. You have to make sure your amendment isn't just going to fail anyway. And at the end of the day, you have to convince the judge that the overall interests of justice demand that you get leave to amend. All right, now for a classic trap. This is something that trips people up in exams all the time. The difference between Rule 376 and Rule 69. If you mix these two up, you're in trouble, so let's make this crystal clear. This is a critical distinction. Listen carefully. UCPR Rule 376, Subrule 4, is for an existing party who wants to add a new claim. UCPR Rule 69 is for bringing a completely new person or entity into the fight. Think of it this way. 376 is a new weapon for an old soldier. 69 is bringing a new soldier onto the battlefield. And the perfect case to remember this distinction is Australian Golf Management v. Logan City Council. It's a fantastic example of what not to do. The court, with Justice Bowskill, could not have been more blunt. You can't use Rule 376, Subrule 4, as a sneaky backdoor to bring in a claim that actually belongs to someone who isn't even a party to the case. That's using the wrong tool for the job. If you want to do that, the only proper gate is Rule 69. So the bottom line here, the thing you have to burn into your brain for the exam is this. If your amendment is really about bringing in the rights of a new party, You must use Rule 69. You have to pass the tests for Rule 69, not the tests for Rule 376, Subrule 4. Okay, last piece of the puzzle. You might be wondering, why is Rule 376 so strict? Why is it the be-all and end-all? The answer is in the legislative history, and specifically, Section 16 of the Civil Proceedings Act. This is actually a really cool bit of legal history. See, before 2002, this old case called Draney v. Berry said the court had this broad, general power to allow amendments, kind of separate from the rules. But then, in 2002, the government stepped in. They added what is now Section 16, subsection 3 of the CPA, which basically said, hey, the rules of court can actually limit this power. And later cases, like Baker v. Hallett, confirmed that this change elevated Rule 376 to become the one and only source of power for these situations. And what was the result of all that? It's simple. The legislature effectively closed the Draney v. Berry loophole. There is no longer some separate fuzzy discretion for a judge to fall back on. If you want to add a new cause of action out of time, Rule 376 is your one and only gateway. You have to meet its tests. Period. And so we land here with the exact questions you've got to be ready for. You're faced with that expired limitation period. Which gate are you going for? A name fix under Rule 376, Subrule 2, a capacity change under Subrule 3, a new claim under Subrule 4, or wait, is this actually a new party problem that belongs entirely under Rule 69? Knowing the rules is step one. Knowing exactly which one to use and how you're going to prove it's appropriate, well, that's the true test.